Hi everyone, it's Laura here for Studio Katia, and in today's video I'm going to share with you how to create a floral card and how to use heat embossing to create metallic elements for your cards. I started by doing some die cutting off camera. I used the rectangle die in the Darling ribbon and dotted framed set to die cut some Bristol Smooth cardstock by Strathmore to an A2 size, so 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches, as that is the size of my card front. I then cut some more Bristol Smooth cardstock using the dotted square frame die, also by Studio Katia. I'm going to save the very thin frame for my project today, and then I'm going to store this larger frame as well as the smaller square die cuts together with my die so that I can use it for another project later on. I then moved on and started working on my background, and for that I took my A2 sized rectangle and I laid it down in my Misty, and I'm going to do some heat embossing with gold embossing powder today. I first used my anti-static powder tool on my panel, and then I'm going to ink up my stamp with embossing ink. The stamp that I'm using is called Floral Garden. It's by Studio Katia and it's absolutely gorgeous. There is so much you can do. You can create a quick background like I did today. You can watercolor it. You can color it with your colored pencils or any coloring media you like. And as I said, today I went for a bit of a faster route and I'm going to do some emboss resist with distress oxides. So as I said, for that I first stamped my image with clear embossing ink and then I coated it with gold embossing powder by Wow. I had a few specks of embossing powder left on my panel and I cleaned them up with a small paintbrush. And then I melted the embossing powder with my heat gun, and this is always such a fun thing to do. It's always so pretty to see the embossing powder melt and become shiny, especially when you use metallic embossing powders. Here is where I'm going to turn this thin Bristol Smooth cardstock die cut into a metallic accent for my card. So as you see, I basically patted my clear embossing ink pad on this die cut so that I can then coat it with embossing powder and the embossing powder will stick to my paper. And then I can use again my heat gun to heat set the embossing powder and give this die cut a metallic finish. At this point, the surface of my embellishment is not exactly smooth, so I'm going to repeat my step a second and even a third time because this will also make this die cut a little bit thicker with all these layers of embossing powder, which I think is a nice touch. So what I did is I waited for my embossing powder to be completely cold and then I inked up again this piece with my embossing ink. I coated it with gold embossing powder and heat set the embossing powder with my heat gun. As I said, I repeated this a third time and then I moved on and started inking up my background. I'm going to use distress oxides today and my Studio Katia blending brushes to do my blending. The colors that I used are Salty Ocean, Chipped Sapphire and Black Soot. As you saw, for Salty Ocean and Chipped Sapphire, I'm not even switching brushes. I started from the lighter one and then I moved to the darker one so that I do not contaminate my ink pads. I usually have one brush per color and I clean them off on a piece of paper to remove any excess ink. And you can also just wash them with a mild soap and some water, and there is a very nice silicone cleaning tool on the Studio Katia store that you can use to help you remove the ink like from deep inside your bristles. To darken up the edges of this panel a little bit more, I am coming in with Distress Oxide in the color Black Soot, and for this I am using a different brush. I'm going to cover all four sides with my Distress Oxide in Black Soot, and then I'm coming back in with the paintbrush I use for my blue inks, and I'm blending everything together until I get a nice and smooth transition between the different colors. At this point I thought I wanted to spice up this background a little bit more and use this Distress Oxide lift technique. Distress oxides are water reactive, so what you can do is you can take a wet paintbrush or a water brush like I'm doing right now, and you can wet the areas that you want. This will reactivate the ink, and then you can blot off the excess with a paper towel so that basically you have those areas a little bit lighter than the ink blended areas that are dry around them. The intensity of this effect will depend on how much you leave your water on your inks, on the specific color of distress oxide that you use as well, because they all react a little bit different from each other. And I think this is a very easy and very quick way to spice up your ink blended backgrounds a little bit more without, in this case, for example, having to watercolor the individual flowers. This is obviously much faster. I also wanted to mention that I didn't go over the entire image with this technique, but I mostly focused on the flowers and I left the leaves and the rest of the background as it was, so just with the ink blending. And then I decided that I wanted to add just a little bit more texture and a little bit more detail to these beautiful florals, and for that I took a white Prismacolor pencil and I am basically adding almost like brush strokes, so the wrist movement is that of brush strokes at the base and at the tip of the petals. Looking at the card and the way it turned out, I will say that having used the oxide leaf technique and having added these details definitely added to the overall look of the card, but I think the card will be absolutely stunning even if you skipped these steps and just used the ink blended background. For example, if you didn't have a lot of time or if simply this is not your preference. Once I was done adding details to my background, I went ahead and used my Studio Katia glue to adhere my metallic frame to the background. The dotted detail on the background die cut is going to be a guide for the positioning of this metallic frame, and because it is a little bit rigid because of the embossing powder, I am using a heavy acrylic block to hold it down until the glue dries. While the glue was drying, I worked on my sentiment, and for that I used one of the new dies in the Studio Katia store. This is called the Lovely Word dies. It is an actual set of dies, and I chose the one that cuts the word hugs. Again, I turned this into a metallic die cut by coating the paper with clear embossing ink, then covering everything with gold embossing powder and heat setting the embossing powder with my heat gun. Also in this case I added 2 layers of embossing powder so that I get a nice and dimensional result, and then I also created a third metallic accent on my card using this domed shaped die from the Scallop Square set by Studio Katia. If you know me by now, you will know that I cannot resist a cute stamp set, and these honeybees by Studio Katia are absolutely adorable. So because we had this floral background, I thought I could add these bees and kind of, fuse together this more cute and whimsical style with a more elegant background, and I have to admit that I really like the way the two sets work together. For the coloring, I used my Illustrator markers and I stamped the images with alcohol-proof ink by Spectrum Noir. And for the color palette, I'm using a bit more of a muted one compared to the ones I used with other cards that I have made in the past with this stamp set. The reason why I chose less saturated colors is that I felt they would match a little bit more nicely the background that I have. It is after all a more elegant type of background. We have those gold accents, so to match those I threw in some browns for the shadows of my yellows rather than the oranges that I use when I want to go for a bit of a brighter look. And also for the wings, I used some vintage blues rather than my usual teal blues, because again, I felt those were a nicer match to the more muted blues that I have on my background. The coloring was really quick and very easy for these images. They aren't very large, so it doesn't take a lot of time. And then once I was done, I die cut them with the honeybees coordinating dies. I decided to mount this domed metallic die cut onto some vellum to create kind of a focal point for my card, and the vellum will mute down the background a little bit more and create an accent. Again, because these die cuts are a little bit rigid because of the embossing powder, it helps to use an acrylic block to keep them down while the glue dries, and then I used my scissors to trim off the excess vellum. I coated the back of the die cut with my Studio Katia liquid glue, and I'm not putting any glue where the vellum shows because the glue will be visible through it. I had very inky fingers and I have a little bit of an ink smudge there, but because distress oxides are water reactive, I could just basically use my water brush and paint it out, so I basically erased my smudge with the water in the paintbrush. Next, I could decorate my card front using the sentiment die cut as well as my bees. Off camera, I'll end up also coloring and die cutting one more bee because I felt I needed something to fill the space on the top portion of the card. The coloring again was very quick and was the same that I did for my other bee, and I am adhering them to my card front, sort of creating a visual triangle to make the composition look a little bit more pleasing. I decided to also add some embellishments, so I picked up my gold foil confetti to match my gold embossing powder, and I'm going to adhere them around my bees and my sentiment using Studio Katia glue and the Studio Katia embellishment wand. I talked about this tool in my previous video for Studio Katia and I absolutely love it. It's really easy to use, it picks up your embellishments really nicely, and you can use the metal tip to move them around while you are deciding on their positioning on your card fronts. So this is my new go-to tool for embellishments. I have my card base here, which is some heavyweight white cardstock cut to 5.5 by 8.5 inches and scored at 4.25 inches. And I'm going to finish off my card by taping down the card front onto my card base. And here you can see the final result. I really love the look of the gold embossing powder and I love the fusion between this more elegant background and these adorable bees. And that's it for today. I really hope you enjoyed this video and I hope I inspired you to create with the Studio Katia Floral Garden and Honey Bees stamp sets. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe for more card making and paper crafting inspiration. Thank you all so much for stopping by and have a great day.